The sun over the Helmand province was a white-hot brand, searing itself into the skin of everything it touched. It was the kind of heat that made the air itself shimmer and dance, turning the distant, dusty mountains into mirages. For Sergeant First Class Marcus Thorne, a 20-year veteran of the United States Army, this was his 5th deployment. The weight of the desert, the tension, the ever-present smell of cordite and sweat, it was as familiar as the lines on his own face. And he stood in the command tent, a structure that offered shade but no relief from the oppressive heat, staring at a map spread across a folding table. His brow was furrowed, a deep canyon of worry etched between his eyes. For 3 weeks, their forward operating base, FOM Titan, had been living under a ghost, a deadly, invisible specter that had claimed the lives of 4 of his men. The official reports called them freak incidents. Soldiers stepping outside for a cigarette, a mechanic working on a Humvee, a sergeant walking to the mess tent. Each one had dropped without a sound, a single, perfect bullet hole appearing as if by magic. No report, no echo, nothing. The base's sniper teams, the best in the battalion, had scoured every inch of the surrounding terrain. They had calculated every possible vantage point, from the crumbling mud brick compounds to the jagged ridge lines miles away. Their conclusions were always the same: impossible. No shooter could be that accurate from that far. The wind alone, a fickle and cruel mistress in this part of the world, would make a shot over a mile laughably improbable. Inside the tent, the air was thick with frustration and grief. Major General Hal Watson, a bulldog of a man with a neck as thick as a tire and a temper to match, slammed his fist on the table, making the scattered papers jump. 3 weeks, he bellowed, his voice raw. 3 weeks, and we're sitting ducks. My soldiers are being picked off in their own goddamn home, and I have nothing to tell their families. He glared at the assembled officers and NCOs. Captain Miller, the young and harried intelligence officer, shuffled his feet. Lieutenant Colonel Briggs, the battalion commander, stared stonily at the map, his jaw tight. "We've run every simulation, sir," Captain Miller began, his voice trembling slightly. "The terrain analysis is conclusive. The closest structure with a conceivable sight line is at 3,800 meters. At that distance, with the thermal winds coming off the valley floor, it's not a shot, sir. It's a statistical anomaly. Even the most advanced rifles and scopes can't guarantee that kind of precision." "I don't give a damn about your statistics, Captain," Watson roared. "My men aren't anomalies." They're dead." It was in the heavy silence that followed the outburst that the general's gaze swept across the room. He saw the hardened faces of his rangers, the worried looks of his junior officers, and then his eyes landed on a figure standing quietly near the back of the tent, half hidden behind a support pole. Specialist Lena Volkov. She was a slight woman with sharp, Asiatic features and dark, intelligent eyes that held an unnerving stillness. She was an interpreter, a contracted linguist attached to their unit, valued for her fluency in Pashto and Dari. She was quiet, efficient, and utterly forgettable in a sea of camouflage and muscle. No one paid her any mind. She was furniture. The general's question was born of pure, desperate frustration. He wasn't looking for an answer from her. He was just thinking out loud, venting his rage at the universe. "Is there a sniper among us?" he snapped, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or does anyone in this tent know how to kill a man from 4,000 meters? A profound, uncomfortable silence fell. No one met the general's eye. No one except Lena Volkov. She looked up from the patch of sand she'd been studying, and in a voice as calm and flat as the desert floor, she spoke. "It's 4,200 meters, General. From the second-story window of the village of Kazir to the southern gate of the motor pool. That's where your sergeant was hit." Every head in the tent swiveled towards her. It was as if a chair had suddenly spoken. General Watson blinked, his rage momentarily replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. Captain Miller sputtered, "What?" That's that's absurd. Kazir is a ghost village. We've cleared it twice. And the distance is 4,200 meters, Lena repeated, her gaze unwavering. The shooter is using a modified Russian OSV-96, chambered for a 12.7 by 108 millimeter round. He's firing subsonic ammunition, which is why you hear no report. The bullet is traveling slower than the speed of sound. By the time it hits, the sound of the shot is still traveling behind it. You hear nothing until after the impact, and by then, the location of the muzzle blast is impossible to triangulate from the base. The tent was utterly silent. The general stared at her, his mind reeling. This wasn't a linguist. This was something else entirely. Who the hell are you?" he finally asked, his voice a low growl. Lena met his gaze without flinching. "Specialist Volkov. I'm your interpreter, sir." "Bull," the general said. "Interpreters don't know ballistics and enemy equipment like that. Talk." There was a long, tense pause. Lena's eyes flickered just for a moment, with a memory that was clearly painful. "Before this," she said, her voice dropping even lower, "I was something else, in another life. Captain Miller." See, his pride, wounded by having his analysis publicly refuted by a linguist, scoffed. "This is ridiculous. We have teams of analysts, satellite imagery, drones. We would have seen a modified rifle, a shooter in that village. You're making wild guesses." Lena turned her unnervingly calm eyes on him. "You're not looking for a single man, Captain. You're looking for a military position. You're looking for a nest. He's not in a nest. He's in a room. A room with a mattress on the floor. And a wet sheet over the window to cool the air and reduce the heat shimmer from his scope. And a small, battery-powered fan. He takes one shot a day, sometimes one every 2 days. He doesn't need a spotter. He's been doing this for a long time." The detail was chillingly precise. It painted a picture so vivid, so real, that it silenced the captain. General Watson leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "You seem to know a hell of a lot about how this man thinks, a specialist." "Because I know how I would do it, sir," she said simply. The words hung in the air, a confession and a challenge all at once. The general didn't ask for her story. Not then. He simply looked at the men in the room and issued a new order. "Captain Miller, get me eyes on Kazir, low and slow. And I want every piece of satellite intel on that village for the last month. Now." He then looked back at Lena. "Specialist Volkov, you're with me." For the next 2 hours, in a smaller, stiflingly hot briefing room, the general and his top officers grilled Lena. She spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had lived and breathed this world. She explained the complexities of extreme long-range shooting, the Coriolis effect, the spin drift, the density of the air, the angle of the shot. She described the shooter's likely routine, his escape routes, his supply lines. The intelligence officers, initially skeptical, began to take frantic notes as her hypotheses started to match up with the raw, unprocessed data they were now receiving. Satellite imagery from 2 weeks prior showed a faint heat signature in a specific second-story room of a building in Kazir, something they had previously dismissed as a stray animal or a fault in the sensor. A drone flight ordered by the general confirmed fresh tire tracks on a hidden path leading away from the back of the village, a path they had previously overlooked. And the pieces were falling into place, and they were falling exactly as Lena had predicted. Finally, the general leaned back in his chair. He looked exhausted, but a new, sharp focus had replaced his earlier rage. He looked at Lena. "You said you were something else in another life. I'm not going to pry. We all have ghosts. But right now, I have a ghost of my own to kill. That man out there is a professional, a true expert. Our snipers are the best the U.S. Army has to offer. But they've never faced a target at this range. They've trained for 1,000, maybe 1,200 meters. This is a different world." He paused, looking directly into her eyes. "Is there anyone in my command who can make this shot?" The question was clear. He wasn't asking about his men anymore. He was asking her. Lena looked down at her hands, resting calmly on the table. They were not the soft hands of an interpreter. They were strong, scarred, with calluses on the trigger finger that any soldier would recognize. She thought of the 4 men who had died. She thought of the faces of their friends, the hollow grief in the mess hall. She thought of a life she had tried to leave behind, a life of shadows and silence and the weight of a rifle. She had come to America for a fresh start, to bury that person under the mundane duties of a translator. But that person was still there, a skill set that didn't just disappear, in a knowledge of death that was as much a part of her as her own bones. She looked up. "The Dragunov they issue to our spotters is a toy for this range," she said quietly. "You'd need an M107, but you'd have to free-float the barrel, hand-load the ammunition to account for every variable, and build a stable, elevated platform. And you'd still need someone who understands that at that distance, you're not pointing a gun, you're aiming a physics problem. You're predicting where a small piece of metal will be 2.5 seconds from now in an environment that is constantly shifting." "Can you do it?" the general pressed, his voice barely a whisper. Another long silence. The air conditioner wheezed and rattled in the corner. Lena's gaze drifted to the window, towards the distant, shimmering ridgelines. She could almost feel the wind on her face, feel the weight of the stock against her shoulder, the slow, so rhythmic beat of her heart as she waited for the exact moment between one breath and the next. It was a world she had promised herself she would never enter again. "I can try," she finally said. It was not a boast. It was a simple, terrifying statement of fact. The next 24 hours were a blur of activity. A specialized .50 caliber rifle, usually reserved for anti-materiel work, was requisitioned and prepped. The unit's armorer, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Kowalski, worked alongside Lena, and he watched in stunned silence as this quiet, unassuming woman field-stripped the massive weapon with a speed and familiarity that rivaled his own. She rejected the standard ammunition, asking for specific lots of powder and bullets. She spent hours hand-loading cartridges on a portable press, weighing each grain of powder with the precision of a jeweler, checking the concentricity of each bullet. And she talked about ballistic coefficients and gyroscopic stability as if she were discussing the weather. As dusk approached, Lena and her chosen spotter, a young, eager specialist named David Chen, prepared to move out. Their mission was to exfiltrate the base under the cover of darkness, establish a hide site on a ridgeline almost 2 miles from the base, and wait. They wouldn't be aiming at the village of Kazir itself, but at a point in the valley between the base and the village. And the intelligence suggested the enemy sniper, emboldened by his success, was growing more confident. They predicted he might attempt another shot the following morning. Their task was not to shoot into the village, but to intercept his bullet. The theory was insane. 2 projectiles, fired from nearly 2 miles apart, crossing paths in the vast emptiness of the Afghan sky. It was like trying to hit a single specific raindrop in a thunderstorm. But Lena had explained it with a calm, a logical detachment. The sniper's bullet would be traveling on a predictable arc. By positioning themselves perpendicular to his line of fire and using a powerful targeting laser and a sophisticated ballistic computer linked to her scope, they could, in theory, aim at the point in space where the 2 trajectories would intersect. It was a shot that had never been successfully attempted in combat. The night was cold and black. Lena and Chen moved like wraiths, navigating by starlight, their NVGs painting the world in shades of green. They reached their predetermined position, a small, rocky depression on a ridge, just as the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky. Lena set up the massive rifle, its bulk seeming to absorb the darkness around it. She extended the bipod legs, but also used sandbags to create an unshakable platform. She lay prone, her body molded to the earth, becoming part of the landscape. Chen set up the targeting laser and a high-powered spotting scope, his hands shaking slightly from the cold and the sheer, unbelievable pressure of the moment. Through her scope, Lena could see the village of Kazir, a cluster of mud-brick ruins huddled against a hillside. The second-story window she had identified was a black, empty eye socket. The wind was already beginning to stir, a gentle breath that would become a gusting challenge as the sun rose. She checked her instruments. Humidity and barometric pressure, temperature, wind speed at their location. The ballistic computer, linked to a small weather station beside her, crunched the numbers, feeding corrections to the scope's reticle. Then came the waiting. The hardest part. They lay motionless for over 2 hours as the sun climbed, baking them in their ghillie suits. Ants crawled over Lena's hands. She didn't move. Her breathing was slow, rhythmic, meditative. And her entire world had shrunk to the intersection of the crosshairs and the empty window across the valley. Chen scanned the village through his scope, his whispered updates a constant low murmur. No movement. Still nothing. Thermal is cold. Then, at 9:47, Chen's voice changed. It was tighter, higher. Contact. Window. Heat signature resolving. He's setting up. Confirmed. It's him. Lena didn't need to be told. She saw the faintest flicker of movement in the dark window. A disruption of the blackness. The ghost was there, making himself real. Her crosshairs didn't move. She wasn't aiming at the window. She was aiming at a point in the empty sky, hundreds of feet above the valley floor, her scope's reticle adjusted for an impossible lead. Range to target window is 4,210 meters, Chen whispered, his voice straining to remain calm. Projected shot is 4,200. He'll fire any second. Lena's finger rested on the trigger, feeling the minute take-up. She wasn't thinking about the man in the window. She wasn't thinking about the 4 dead soldiers. She wasn't thinking about the general or Chen or the life she had tried to build. She was thinking about the wind, about the temperature, about the spin of the earth, about a tiny piece of metal, a .50 caliber bullet, that she was about to send on a 2.5-second journey to a point in space that existed only in her mind. She was a mathematician, a physicist, a machine. He's aiming, Chen breathed. He's firing! It happened in a fraction of a second. Lena saw a faint, almost imperceptible puff of dust from the window in Kazir. At the same instant, her own world exploded. She squeezed the trigger. The M107 roared, a thunderous crack that shattered the silence of the valley, the massive recoil slamming into her shoulder. The ejected casing spun through the air, glittering in the sun. She didn't flinch. Her eye was glued to the scope, tracking her imaginary target. 2.5 seconds was an eternity. Chen watched through his scope, his breath held. He saw the enemy's bullet, a streak of displaced air, heading towards the base. And then he saw it. A fraction of a second later, a second streak, Lena's bullet, arcing up from their ridge. The 2 invisible lines of death, drawn by 2 men miles apart, converged in a silent, terrible ballet. There was no explosion, no dramatic clash of metal. So one moment there were 2 bullets. The next, there was a brief, shimmering distortion in the air, like heat rising from a road. A puff of metallic dust, glittering briefly in the morning sun, was all that remained. The enemy's bullet, its perfect trajectory disrupted by the catastrophic impact, tumbled wildly, end over end, and buried itself harmlessly in the sand a mile short of the base. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, over the radio, a frantic voice from the FOB. FOM Titan to OP Echo. We heard a shot, a single shot. What's your status? Over. Chen couldn't speak. He just stared through his scope at the window in Kazir. It was empty. The ghost was gone. He looked at Lena. She hadn't moved. Her eye was still to the scope. Then slowly she pulled back, letting out a long, slow breath. She looked at Chen, her face streaked with dust and sweat, her eyes holding a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Relief? Regret? Exhaustion? "Target eliminated," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper over the radio. "I repeat, the threat is neutralized. We're coming home." Back at the FOB, the news spread like wildfire. A miracle shot. A 1 in a million. The men in the command tent, who had listened to the entire exchange over the speakers, were dumbstruck. General Watson simply closed his eyes and let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for 3 weeks. Captain Miller stared at the empty chair where the quiet linguist had sat just hours before, his entire worldview shattered. When Lena and Chen finally walked back through the gates of FOM Titan, they were met not by a cheering crowd, but by a profound, reverent silence. The soldiers who had lost their brothers, who had lived under the shadow of the ghost, just watched her pass. A young private, his eyes red-rimmed, simply nodded at her. A sergeant, a man she'd translated for a dozen times, stepped forward and offered her his canteen. She took it, took a long drink, and handed it back. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Later that evening, General Watson found her sitting alone on a sand-bagged parapet, watching the sun set over the mountains that had tried to claim his men. He stood beside her for a long time, saying nothing. Finally, he spoke, his voice gruff with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "I don't know who you were, Specialist, and I'm not going to ask. But whoever you were, she saved a lot of lives today. On behalf of the United States Army, and on behalf of those 4 families who won't be getting another folded flag, thank you." Lena didn't look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the distant horizon, on the place where she had stared down death and, for one brief, violent moment, had become it again. "You're welcome, sir," she said softly. And in that moment, the 2 women, the ghost she had been and the woman she was trying to become, stood together in the fading light under the same indifferent Afghan sky.